Alright guys, welcome to another video. Today we're going to talk about some blind spots in Rise of Kingdoms that lead to common mistakes. This could get really in-depth. By the way, I've already tried to do this video like 15 times just because I realized I could start talking forever about this. But in general, we're going to talk about some of the mechanisms that led people to invest in Sargon, right? Like why people invested in him, and then even after seeing results in the open field where it wasn't that great, but still wanted to defend him and keep using him. Two, we'll talk about some influences on people that they don't realize. We're all always stereotyping, right? We're taught that stereotyping is bad. It's actually neither good or bad. It's actually necessary for us to take an information overload, essentially, like everywhere we go, and then dumb it down or simplify it down so we can at least make some calculations or assumptions, right? Now, a lot of times they're wrong, right? And what good self-awareness is to actually notice when stereotypes aren't necessarily really helpful, we're just straight up wrong, and then adjust on the fly, right? But the ability to actually stereotype is really important for us to operate in society. And the third one is just talking about numbers, right? I noticed that a lot of people aren't necessarily they don't have a good fundamental understanding of numbers. And then when you don't have a good fundamental understanding of numbers, then everything you kind of try to do on top of that is not going to be sound, right? And usually what it happens is you end up with something like our current education system where, for example, if you're not comfortable with math, but you want to get a good grade in the class or pass a test, what do? You force yourself to memorize buzzwords or just like how to do something without understanding why you're doing it. And then once you pass the test, you forget it, right? The reason why I have a drum and a horn on here is because that's one of the recent videos I made. And just based on the comments for some people, I noticed that one, there wasn't necessarily a fundamental understanding of numbers, and then two, a lot of people just like to default to, like, say, quote unquote the expert or the authority figure, right? In this case, a lot of it is like YouTube or what, say, like a big player says. And I'm not necessarily discounting that, right? Because experts, let's not talk about YouTube. That's a whole different story, right? I'm a YouTuber. But experts are experts for a reason, right? They're supposed to be experts in their field. They spend a lot of time in it. They have the experience, they probably are more specialized in that. But they're also human beings. A lot of times they can be wrong. And I don't think it is just one side's responsibility or the other. I think it's a responsibility for experts to be able to explain stuff in a way that's easy to digest and understand, right? So they can actually justify their opinion or why they say something they're saying. And at the same time, it is a responsibility for the audience to at least get a baseline understanding of how something works, right? You don't have to be an expert, but you have to at least understand the basics of how something works so that when the expert is telling you why they're recommending something, right, you can determine for yourself whether that rationale makes sense or it doesn't make sense, right? So you could actually have a healthy back and forth in a dialogue. And I think a lot of times the people that are actually listening to the experts, they're just lacking this fundamental understanding. And then it's very easy to just default to an expert without actually being able to determine whether whatever the expert is recommending really makes sense or not, right? So obviously I'm talking about ROK right now, but if you want to extrapolate that out to real life, you can imagine there's a whole world out there where this also applies. So overview, what we're going to talk about. First, we'll talk about what causes blind spots. In this case, blind spots, how do we give an analogy for what a blind spot is, right? It's basically something that is in plain sight where it is there, but then the person is just can't see it or can't see the influence of it, right? So you can imagine if there's like a dog whistle, and if I blow the dog whistle, it's actually still at that frequency, but it's just at a frequency that the person can't hear. But if there's a dog right next to that person, they can hear it loud and clear, right? And the goal isn't to not have blind spots. We all have them. We're going to have them in the future. I have a lot of blind spots. And then kind of the funny thing is, when you have a blind spot, you don't actually even realize what the blind spot is until after the fact, right? But a lot of times blind spots actually will kind of put you on this like narrow path or narrow cone of view where anything that doesn't fit that narrative, you either tune out or you justify away. And one of the most important things I think for a human being operating in today's society is to actually be able to have the self-awareness or consciousness to simultaneously be open to the fact that they could have a blind spot and notice it and still operate in the world, right? Because on one hand, you have to actually be able to trust your judgment. On the other hand, you also have to be open to the possibility that your judgment is heavily influenced, and you could be you're willing to move off of it. As I was actually making this video, I came across a term called cognitive bias. Cognitive bias refers to when it's easy to see the bias acting upon someone else, but then we're oblivious to the bias that's acting on us, right? So I'm gonna say this because I don't think it's gonna offend anyone here, right? Because I highly doubt there's any North Korean players of ROK. But if you ever seen like a North Korean propaganda video, right? One, it's kind of funny, it's crazy, right? But then two, I know I thought this, and I know a lot of people think this. Like, how do people actually believe this stuff, right? Like whatever they're saying, like how Kim Il Sung, their previous leader, got like 17 hole-in-ones out of 18 holes. He's like proficient in like this martial arts, whatever the narratives, right? So it's very easy to see that propaganda is going on in North Korea, and just something that I'm almost always aware of is like what kind of propaganda is actually operating on me, right? It's like we tend to think, and I knew I felt this for a long time in my life. It's like, oh yeah, there's propaganda going on in this part of the world and this part of the world, but there's no propaganda going on here, like stateside. Right. Whereas like now it's like, no, there's definitely stuff going on. And it's cool just to kind of notice the influence of that. It's not necessarily even malicious, because a lot of times propaganda has like a very negative connotation. But most people in their country, they want to feel like they're actually doing what's right, they're doing what's best for the world. Right. And it's important that they're on the side of good. I don't think there's a lot of people that willingly join the bad or evil side. Like, yeah, we're here to terrorize or do bad in the world, and then they're actually, that's how their worldview is, right? They actually think they're making a positive impact in the world. We're doing right. We're fighting against a villain in some way, and that's just the human psyche. Okay, so it's very important to notice blind spots. We'll tie it back into ROK. We'll talk specifically about some commanders. How there's some blind spots when we're judging player effectiveness, numbers specifically, and at the end we'll talk about some ways to minimize your blind spots. That is both applicable in the game, but then also in real life. Right. So I talked about our education system before. I think this is a lot of takes on this video, so I don't remember, but this is one of my favorite quotes. It's that everybody's a genius, by Albert Einstein. Everybody is a genius, which is true, right? Everyone actually has a propensity for something. Some stuff just comes easier to people. Everybody has a genius. Whether they explore it or not, that's on them. But everyone has a natural affinity to something or some things. But if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid, right? And I had this experience in the education system. It wasn't so much that I thought I was stupid, but I definitely, in high school, there's other people that thought I was stupid because I just didn't really take to or see how the education system was really helping us learn, right? And my narrative about myself, because if I'm not stupid, then I must be lazy, right? Because or else why can't I really get into this, or why can't I really study? And to be fair, I did actually get decent grades by society standards. I think that Asian cultural influence was very strong, right? I actually ended up getting a master's, but having been through the U.S. education system up through the higher education, right, the master's level, I did not enjoy it necessarily. And having gone through it and then having to realize I could learn stuff on my own, I realized that the way I learn, and I think the way most people learn, does not necessarily fit with how our education system actually promotes learning. All right, so what causes blind spots, right? I used this quote before, check your premise. So check your premise is actually from an Ayn Rand book, right? One of the, I don't know if he's the main character, but he uses that quote a lot over and over. And the whole idea is that you want to actually see the perspective that it's coming from, where the influence is for the perspective that's coming from, right? So I don't feel like I'm ruining it at this point just because Harry Potter has been out and done for a long time, right? But if you didn't know, spoiler alert for Harry Potter, if you somehow still want to read Harry Potter, right? But if you didn't know, Snape is actually a good guy, right? So if you don't know who Snape is, he was actually one of the villains in the book for most of the book. He was an instructor at Hogwarts, And it turns out that he was actually a good guy that was working with Dumbledore and really trying to protect Harry Potter, right? But the way the author showed the Snape throughout the whole series, it was like he was this guy that hated Harry Potter and that was just there to sabotage everything he did, right? So it wasn't revealed until the very end of the book that he was actually in love with Harry Potter's mom, and it was like kind of his duty to look after Harry Potter, and did it in his own way, and it completely changed the narrative with a view of him. Right, so that's like a very dramatic example, but the whole idea is we always have influences on us that we don't even think about, right? So a lot of times the blind spots comes from that, and it's not that you don't have these influences, it's that there is enough of a self-awareness to notice the influences as they're happening, and then if something doesn't actually really serve you, you can choose something a lot more productive, right? We tend to want to talk about like stereotype like it's like a racial thing or something bad, and I've talked about this earlier. Stereotypes are necessary for a reason. The goal though isn't to not have stereotypes, it's so that when there are stereotypes that naturally arise, you let the ones that serve you be there, and then the ones that don't serve, there's enough of a consciousness or self-awareness to choose something that serves better, right? The second one is a lack of understanding. So one of the biggest barriers to learning is that, for example, if you're trying to learn multiplication and it's really, really hard, right? It's probably not the multiplication that's actually hard for you. There's actually something, the step before that, when numbers that you're just not fundamentally sound at, right? So a lot of times when there's a lack of understanding, it's not the thing that people don't understand that's a challenge. It is, but it's actually the thing before that that's not fundamentally sound that leads to the lack of understanding. Okay. The other one is going to be a lack of nuance, right? So, for example, no nuance would be like we're saying sodium is bad, right? Calcium's good, it's good for your bones. Sodium's bad, it's bad for your blood pressure, right? Whereas when you start getting into nuance, you start learning your body needs a certain amount of sodium within a certain range to regulate blood pressure. If it's too high, that's not good. If it's too low, that's not good, right? But it's not inherently good or bad. It's just like you need a certain amount for your blood pressure to function the way it's supposed to. If you guys didn't understand like brain biology, right? The cerebral cortex, right, a part of your brain is responsible for the upper executive function, where you can actually notice multiple perspectives. When someone is fear or stress or in a fear state, the stress actually shuts that part of the brain down, and then you actually go down to the amygdala, right? And you're just kind of on autopilot, right? The illusion is that the person is awake, but they actually have no ability when they're stressed to process nuance, right? They just need to be able to make quick snap judgment decisions. A or B, do I do this or that, right? There's studies after studies of this where people are stressed and then they have them try to make like nuanced decision making, and it just completely falls apart, right? So this isn't something that's like a theory. It's actually been proven over and over again, right? When you are polarized, right? So when something has to be simplified, whether it's like a good side and an evil side, or it's choice A versus choice B, and it's just one or the other, there's usually a lack of nuance there. And when there's a lack of nuance, essentially the person is on autopilot, right? You could call that person like unconscious, or they're awake, but they're actually not conscious of the automatic responses that they're doing. A lot of people that, whether it's going to a therapist or self-development or something that people tend to get fixated on when they first have a realization is they start noticing their patterns, right? It's like, oh wow, I actually notice I self-sabotage in my relationships, right? And they just want to talk about that. By the way, it doesn't do anything. Noticing your patterns doesn't do anything, but noticing patterns is very, very rewarding for a lot of people, because before they tend to actually want to blame the circumstance, and then when they can start noticing their patterns, that's like probably one of the first times where they could realize like how they play a part in everything, and it's a very empowering feeling, right? There's definitely steps after that, but that's why you see a lot of people that love to talk about their patterns, is because of that, right? But if you can't even recognize your patterns, game over, right? There's nothing to talk about. And then finally, I touched on this earlier, we tend to want to default to like authority figures or experts, right? And YouTube, you can imagine who are the authority figures or experts that we just want to listen to. And it's important to, still like listen to what they say and be open-minded to it. And at the same time, like realize that the authority figures are human beings, right? They make mistakes all the time. You want them to help increase your understanding, not confuse you more, right? So if they make a judgment, I mean, they make a call, or they make a recommendation or a statement about something. Why? Like, why do they make that statement? Does the rationale make sense? Does it actually fit into the understanding? And as opposed to just taking their word for it, right? It's like, oh, well, this person did this, like, fine, right? If they set up an experiment to do something, right? We learn about the scientific process. We all learned about it in middle school, I hope. It's that, when you're when you're doing real science, right? You have a hypothesis for how something works. And then if you're setting up a good experiment, you can actually isolate the independent variable, right? So the variable that you actually want to test, and then the experiment, if it's set up correctly, should isolate everything else that could affect the outcome of the experiment, so you could just test the independent variable, right? And then if you could test the independent variable to kind of meet the hypothesis, then that's good. Now it becomes a little bit more sure, and then you still want to actually set up other experiments to test it in different ways until you could be pretty sure of it, and then it becomes a theory, right? I feel like a lot of that has gotten lost, nowadays. People are throwing out science or the scientific process left and right? But really, that's what we all learn, at least stateside, when we were younger, about what the scientific process is, right? So when it comes to authority figures, it's important to actually, respect their experience and the wisdom that they potentially have, but then also have a fundamental understanding of whatever it is that they're talking about. It doesn't take much to have a fundamental understanding, right? So that when people tell you stuff, there's enough understanding where you could tell whether it makes sense or not. Finally, one of my favorite quotes here, right? We don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are, right? You can imagine we tend to actually create our own reality, right? So if I go around and I think people suck, okay, if I walk around the world thinking people suck, how do you think the people that encounter me are gonna feel? They're not gonna feel good around me because I inherently think they suck, right? So it's more likely I'm gonna actually get a negative experience with people, and it kind of fuels that, right? And I think it's very important to notice that, yes, your experience is people sucks, but also your worldview is that people sucks, right? Like at some point, I think the most empowering thing is to start realizing that worldview and then choosing something more productive and different. All right, so let's actually get into commanders. All right, so here we have Attila, right? Attila is obviously a very old commander. And one of the things that I hear people talk a lot about is, the age of a commander, right? The age of a commander, really what we're talking about is the idea that with every new generation, there's a power creep, right? So if someone's a third generation commander, you would think a sixth generation commander is better. That's one of the mechanisms that made people think Sargon is so good, because at the time when he came out, he was the latest and greatest infantry commander, right? And because he's the latest and greatest infantry commander, because he's the newest generation, he must be really, 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 really good. And that just turned out to be not the case, right? So when we're judging how good a commander is, what we're really judging is how good is his kit, right? Because if one commander's kit is better than the other, the age doesn't really matter, right? Like that, like me saying that right now, it should be really, really clear. It's just whoever's better is better. It doesn't matter which one's newer or older, right? But the age of a commander definitely actually has a lot of influence on us. The other one too is when you're judging how good of a commander is. So for example, I talk about how I think Lucia is the best commander of the game. I think Herman is the second best commander in the game, right? That's talking about their kit individually, right? Individually, their kit determines how good of a commander they are. And there is some overlap, right? There is some like correlation. When a commander is really good, it's more likely that when they're pairing with someone that is really good, But when it comes to commander pairings, something we don't get to factor in when you're judging a commander on a standalone value is their synergy, right? So for example, if I came out with an infantry commander now that really synergizes with silence, right? So maybe the stats are worse than Scipio's, maybe it's a single target commander, but when the target is silence, instead of gaining rage X% faster like Scipio, right? Maybe when the target is silent, you do 50% more damage to it. All of a sudden, maybe Scipio is a better commander than this new commander, but I'm more likely to pair this new commander with Kuang than Scipio, right? So the point I'm trying to highlight here is that a standalone value for a commander is different than how good that commander is in a pair and the synergy they bring. And a lot of times, when I see people make arguments, they're kind of conflating the two, right? Whereas like maybe the standalone version is better than the other one, so then it's hard for them to move off the position that as a pair, the worst commander, the commander that's not as good as the other one, can actually form a better pair than the better one. If that makes sense. I think Alex and Scipio kind of can fall into that category, right? My personal opinion, Lucia Alex right now before William Wallace came out is the best Smarch in the game, right? Now, if you just look at their kit, I don't think anyone will argue that Scipio's kit is better than Alex's kit. Scipio is a better commander than Alex. But when it comes to the pair, I would take Lucia Alex over Lucia Scipio, right? That's also a little bit different than from the idea of a commander as a good investment for the future, right? So a lot of times people will talk about how, okay, a commander as a good investment will need AoE, they need march speed, they need a debuff, right? And that makes them a good future investment, right? And the reason why is because when you have those things, you're way more dynamic in your ability to pair with different kinds of commanders in the future, right? Because if Scipio has AoE, then if the new commander comes out and has AoE or single target, it would probably be able to fit with Scipio. Whereas if Scipio is only a single target, then if the new commander is single target, it's probably not going to be a good fit, right? So just because a commander could be a good investment for the future doesn't necessarily mean that it'll actually fit really well, because these commanders that are coming out by Lilith, they're not random, right? They're actually by design. So whenever a commander comes out, you have to realize that Lilith specifically designed the commander's kit for a reason and it's always going to synergize really well with a commander or a couple commanders, and then not synergize with other commanders, right? So even though a standalone commander could be better, and it could be better for future investment, but when the future investment actually comes out, because of whatever Lilith decided to take the direction of that commander, the synergy of the new commander could actually be with a commander that's not as good as a standalone, but really good as synergy with that pair, right? Finally, let's talk about this whole idea of a selfish march. So obviously, being selfish is not a quality that we want to be called, right? There's a negative connotation to that, and I hear this word thrown out a lot. All right, when we're talking about a selfish march, right, what we're really talking about is a commander that really doesn't do much like group utility, so or buff or debuff. So basically, whatever you see from the commander is just what you're going to get, right? Like if this commander is putting out AoE and like this damage output, right, that's it. There's no like hidden benefit to the group that you're not really measuring. It's not necessarily a bad thing, and obviously you would prefer for a commander to have a lot of like hidden benefits that don't necessarily show up in their reports or the kit. But like one extreme of this is if you think about someone like Mulan. Mulan is like the ultimate non-selfish march, right? But how many people are running her? They're not, right? So just because someone's a selfish march doesn't mean it's bad, and doesn't mean you have a non-selfish march that's going to be better than a selfish march. You have to actually see the commander or the commander pairing as its value overall, and if a selfish commander's damage output is so high, then it's going to be better than a non-selfish march, right? Because one thing you got, like, I don't think people realize with percentages is like you actually need high damage output, right? Like a 30% increase in damage for someone that's dealing 100 damage is going to be 30. For someone that's dealing 1,000 damage, it's going to be 300, right? So a lot of times the commander that's dealing 1,000 is actually going to be quote unquote a selfish march, right? But like you need high damage output that's maybe selfish, that doesn't have a lot of group buff or debuff, to take advantage of these percentage increases, right? Whereas like if you just have a bunch of non-selfish a bunch of unselfish marches, right? If I was just running 5 different variations of like Trajan and Mulan, right? And they're buffing different things and they're all like non-stacking, right? That's great. But like that 5 unselfish march is going to get wrecked fighting someone else that actually has a balance of a lot. And the whole point I'm making here is that Luce does not provide a lot of group utility or buff or debuff, right? The only thing you can make a case for is maybe this like rage reduction that's coming out with the smite, or maybe the march speed reduction. And William Wallace is similar, except he doesn't even have an AoE, right? But the argument I'm making for William Wallace and Luce is that the damage output of that march is going to be so much higher than everyone else that you're almost forced to invest in William Wallace, and then you're almost forced to pair William Wallace with Luce. Because William Wallace by himself is going to be a worse commander than Scipio. But that pair with Luce and William Wallace together, the synergy, the amount of actual just damage that it's producing compared to the next closest march is so much higher that I think he's worth it, right? And for reference, the reason why I think it's so much higher, I ran a report managers this whole last KBK, so that's thousands and thousands of reports for a bunch of different commander pairings. The Luce Alex march that I had did 60% more damage than the second closest march. Just 60%, right? Like the average report, the 7 wounds I was dealing was 60% more than the next closest march. You multiply that, you use that to take advantage of the debuffs, the defense debuffs or the health debuffs or the all damage taken debuffs on the other commanders. Like think of how that stacks, right? So for one, it's important to understand when we're talking about a selfish march, what it actually means. It's not necessarily a negative or a positive, but then also just because one march is selfish, one march is not selfish, quote unquote, doesn't necessarily mean the non-selfish one is better. It's just like you need both, especially if they're providing different things. Okay, so and it's very, very important to not just throw that term out there and just go, oh, it's a selfish march, it's not good. That's not true. Okay, it's not true. I said it for the whole march. Like Full Cubane is a quote unquote selfish march, like that commander, unless you're pairing it with William, right? But he could actually still be good. It's just when you're a quote unquote selfish commander, the amount of damage he's putting out is pretty much at face value where you're going to get, right? Like you're not going to account for rage gain for 5 other targets or 4 other targets like William. You're not going to account for like a skill damage debuff that William is doing. You're not going to account for 5 marches in your murder ball gaining defense for X amount of seconds, right? Like, and there's literally a value system you could assign to that you're not worried about, because Pokebane is just rage reduction to launch an active skill and then a pretty good skill damage increase as a primary commander. All right, next is to talk about player effectiveness. Okay, so the first quote there you see is what car does he drive, right? So I make this joke in real life, but it's actually kind of true, right? The 2 things that you really can tell people, and then they pretty much know that will have the biggest impact on their view of your wealth, is 1, your occupation, right? So if I tell someone I'm a doctor, if I tell someone I'm an NBA player, if I tell someone I'm a gym owner, right, you're literally going to think I make X amount of money, or I have a certain amount of money depending on the occupation. The second one is the car that the person drives, right? So if I drive around this car, I think it's a 2006 Acura TXX. I just found like an old plain looking car. It's really, really hard for a person to think I have a lot of money if they see me driving around that car, right? But if I drive around, say like a Porsche, right, the automatic assumption is people are going to think I have a lot of money. So they can know nothing about me, right? But like some of these like factors have a huge impact on our perception or view of a player. So I'm going to give you 2 examples, right? So let's just say someone has a 85 million ID, right? So this account will have been made around the beginning of 2021, right? So they're going on what, 3.5 years now, a little over 3.5 years. And that's 7 bill KP, which you will consider a fighter. They're pretty good. One player with a 3.5-year ID has 150 mil, the other has 85 mil power and 7 mil KP, right? Before I even say anything, how would you feel about these players, right? Naturally, you're actually going to think the 150 mil power player is probably a stronger player, right? But from the way this game works, I can actually make a strong argument that the 85 mil power player with 7 mil KP is actually way more beneficial to the kingdom, right? So the argument for the 150 mil player is that, like objectively, is that they have a lot more troops to kill off, right? So with technology and everything, when you're T5, you're somewhere in the, like maybe like 52 mil to 56 mil range. That accounts for like the power from buildings, technology, everything like that. Above that, it just all becomes troop power, right? So the difference between the 150 and the 85 mil player is there's 65 million power worth of troops. But when you talk about matchmaking, when you talk about the Imperium burden, the 150 mil minimum power player is also taking up 65 mil more power in matchmaking. So for example, when I'm doing matchmaking, right, and I have an 85 mil power player and a 65 mil power player, the matchmaking is going to count that, and it's not just apples to apples because I don't think they're just straight counting power, right? But one important component they're counting is power. Matchmaking is going to consider the 150 mil power the equivalent of the 85 mil power and the 65 mil power in terms of power towards matchmaking, right? So even though the KP is the same and the power is a lot more, if you ask me, I would actually almost all the time prefer the lower power player, right? Just because they will allow me to potentially bring in one extra player, or almost one extra player that could potentially bring 5 more marches onto the field. They're way less of a burden from the Imperium burden, and usually if they're a 85 mil power player, right, and they're still doing that KP, they're going to be very, very productive, right, without the need to actually inflate their power by a lot. Like I would actually, if you give me the two, prefer the 85 mil power player. But if you ask most people that see this, they would actually prefer the higher power player because higher power means better, right? And there's a lot of other factors that go into this. So I don't want to make it where like every time that's the case. But if you just give me these two data points with that account ID off the top of the bat, my initial leaning will actually be towards the 85 mil power player, where I would say most people, I'm venturing to guess, will actually prefer the 150 mil power player, right? The second is, what is the single most important information for a migration, right? If you were doing migration, which I've been doing for the last month or so, what would you actually care about the most? Right? A lot of people will actually care about the power. A lot of people will actually care about the KP, right? What I would actually care about the most is their KP, the last KVK they played, right? Because that's the most recent. So you can start determining a lot of stuff just off of that one piece of information. You see at the bottom there, I have KP greater than kills, greater than deads. Not that it's necessarily better, it's that if you want the most accurate reflection of the type of player you're getting, that's the order I would put those in. Okay, so if you think KP, the reason why I have KP first, let's just say I traded a bunch of T1 kills, right? You're not going to get the KP to reflect the amount of kills that way, right? So no matter how objective based a player is, it still takes a lot of time and effort to actually get an X amount of KP, right? Like, because you just need a certain amount of time, resources, speeds, and an ability to at least like kill people to get that KP. So if I see good KP in a KVK, right? even if they're not a very objective based player, they're really selfish on the side fighting, the likelihood that I'm getting a player that's not going to add value to the kingdom is going to be a lot lower, right? Whereas like if a player has a lot of kills, right, but now there's a possibility that they did it through trading, they did it say in the early game, where they're fighting like a lot, like lower rank players, it's easier for there to be sketchiness, right? So I'm not saying just because a player gets high KP and a KVK they're doing good, but if I had to trust one piece of information, I would trust KP more than kills. The one I would actually trust the least is deads, because you could get zeroed. And also, it doesn't take much to get a lot of deads in a short amount of time, right? If you just want to like span fill like a flag, like I can tell you right now, like I don't go above 90 mil power, right? I usually hover around 85 mil. To me, quote unquote, my goals and my kingdom, I can reach the deads if I wanted to in like less than 5 minutes. Okay, like obviously the conditions have to be set up there, right? But if I'm just like, I'm the only one filling a pass, I'm the only one stuffing a garrison, filling a rally or whatever, I can actually accumulate the deads really quick. So it doesn't mean that deads aren't important, right? Like a player has no deads, obviously something is not right there. Like they're not killing off their troops. But like seeing deads or even high deads, to me, isn't as concrete of a piece of information as seeing the KP of that player in a single KVK. So the autark is really good for that. But even more importantly, I want to know if the KP and the KVK came recently, right? Because it's really, really common. If you go watch the early game, like some of these early game kingdoms now, you'll see players of high power and impressive KP, right? But then when you look at their autark, which it even says they started recording May 3rd of 2023, some of them would just have like 30 million kills, right? So how do you have like 120 mil power and your KP is like 12 bill? But in the last year, so you play what, 3 or 4 KBKs, or at least 2, right? The most kills you actually got in a KBK was 30 mil. That means the account is probably popped, right? So we tend to actually want to look at the power, but in my opinion, the KP specifically in the most recent KBK is the most important piece of information to look at. All right, next is talking about understanding numbers, right? I mentioned this earlier. To be able to actually multiply and subtract, to multiply and divide, you have to actually be really comfortable with adding and subtracting, right? And to be able to actually be good at adding and subtracting, you have to be comfortable with numbers and counting. And if a lot of people, here especially in the States, right, the joke is that Americans suck at math. What I notice is the ability to actually count numbers is weak for a lot of people, and they're the ones that have trouble adding and subtracting. So when it comes to counting, right, if I ask you what 6 plus 4 is, like you should just kind of know, right? Like it should, and it, not just that you memorize what 6 plus 4 is, it's that you actually, there's almost like a understanding, or like you get how these two numbers fit together to produce another number, right? And then once you have that, then when we start getting into stuff like multiplication, division, you understand what that actually means, and then how that actually shows up in real life and really in this game. Right? And then from there, when we get into stuff like percentages, right, like a 30% increase or like a 20% decrease, or something that's like additive or multiplicative, right, like what that actually means. When you talk about like DPS, right, damage per second, right, like if you're doing 500 damage per turn over 3 turns, the DPS is 500, right? Even though in three turns you're doing 1500, like those things start to make sense. But if people don't have a fundamental understanding of numbers, how to count, and then really what like percentages and all these stuff really means, it's very easy to just kind of start following a narrative and really say stuff that reflect that they don't understand numbers, right? The other one is it's very, very easy to want to make a comparison, just like apples to apples when it comes to numbers, right? So I have Stefan Marbury on here. See this dude right here. So a high school prodigy that was really, really hyped. He had an okay NBA career, but I would say most people that kind of follow what he was in high school would agree that he probably underachieved for the amount of hype he got. Right. So for example, his last NBA season in was 2008-2009. He averaged a little under 4 points per game, like 3.8 points per game or something like that. Right. He eventually, a few years later, went to China. And in his, I don't know if he won in his first year, but in his second year in the Chinese basketball league, he played for the Beijing Ducks. He was MVP, he won a championship, right? You can see here, he's celebrating with his Chinese teammates, and he averaged 29 points per game, like 5 rebounds, like 5 assists, somewhere around there, right? Give or take. Now, if you translated that number to the NBA, that would be really, really good, right? Maybe not MVP level, but it's definitely in the conversation for MVP and would be one of the top 10 players in the NBA. But he did that in China, right? And just because the numbers are comparable, would his numbers in the Chinese basketball league translate over to the NBA? No. Like, we understand that, right? Like, you could play Pee Wee basketball and dominate, and your stats won't translate over to high school basketball, right? Because the level of competition is very different. Well, there's some stuff where people are making the comparisons. I feel like they're missing the understanding of that. So, for example, I made a whole video fairly recently about smite damage versus skill damage. They're using a damage factor, right? But then because of the nature of the damage, what the impact of 1 point of smite damage is different from 1 point of skill damage, right? So it's actually really, really hard. Well, not really hard, it's actually easy, but it's like people, like, you have to understand when you're translating skill to smite or smite to skill, that comparison, it's not going to be one-on-one. And a lot of people are making the comparison one-on-one, and then that's where they're going off of their bases, right? So this is one where it's like, check your premise, right? Are you actually relating to smite damage as the equivalent to skill damage? Because if you are, then essentially every assumption you make following that is probably going to be a little bit off, right? Another one, for example, is going to be someone that got their stats in pre-SOC versus SOC. Okay, so if I migrated back to KVK2, right, and I got, say, my stats in the KVK2, would that be the equivalent of the stats I got in, say, like in a SOC, like Imperium level KVK? It's not, right? The competition is different. Just the native player base I'm finding is different. There's no crystal tech. There's all this stuff. It's actually hard to make that apple-to-apple comparison. Oh, and when it comes to KP, DADs, all that stuff, it's going to show up the same, right? The third one is single target versus AoE, right? So when you have Wakubane, 2700 damage factor, right? Single target versus William, right? 1500 damage factor, but for 3 targets, right? One's AoE, one's single target, but it's really hard to get away from that influence when we see the big 2700 number compared to the 1500 number. Right, and then the fourth one is, this is one where I compared, where I talked about why I think William Wallace, Lucia, is going to be the best March in the game, and I would take it over Scipio, Lucia. A lot of people wanted to throw out, well, the 30% health debuff, right? And kind of my counter to that, I don't even know if it's a counter or just like a question for that, is, okay, if the 30% health debuff is so good, and I'm not arguing that it's good, it is really good, how do you actually calculate the value of a 30% health debuff? Right? Because if I could say this commander is doing 20% more damage than this commander and show it numbers wise, when a March has a 30% health debuff on it, how much more damage are they taking? Right? And if you can't really answer that, how can you then make an argument that this health debuff outweighs this damage gain? You can't, right? Because you literally don't even know the value of one side of it, right? But when we don't have an understanding or have put in a little bit of time to figure this stuff out, right? What do we want to do? We want to default to a authority figure. We're kind of like the catchphrase of the day. Well, the debuff is really good, right? A good March needs a debuff, and health is the most important stat. So you have a debuff for the most important stat. This is going to outweigh William Wallace, right? You can see how like there starts to be holes in the argument. Whereas if I told you, hey, a 30% health debuff for a infantry with all legendary, except for with a 4-piece set bonus, except for the Karok's humility, right? So I think all legendary with iconic 1, except for the Karok's humility, you're gonna take 18% more damage compared to when you don't have the 30% health debuff. All of a sudden, I could start making that comparison, right? By the way, that's actually the math for that. Whereas for Cav, it's going to be a little lower, depending on your armaments and stuff. Will probably be closer to 15%. Archer will be somewhere in between because there's more health in infantry, but less health in the Cav equipment. And then infantry, because they have less health, it's going to be about 18%. Okay, so if you ever wanted a number to calculate the value of the health debuff, 30% health debuff, there you go. Now, remember what I talked about earlier, authority figure, expert, or in this case, YouTuber, don't take my word for it, right? There's a formula out there. You can actually go do the math to figure out if it works for you, right? But when I make this recommendation that I think William Wallace is better with Luched than Scipio, that's under the assumption that for infantry, when this health debuff hits, the infantry is going to take about 18% more damage. Okay. All right. So finally, listen with this. This is kind of a stretch, I just, old prime Britney Spears, the title of the album was called In the Zone, right? And when you want to minimize your blind spots, right, you guys have actually probably heard of the idea of a flow state or being in the zone, right? Like when you're a athlete, you're almost like you're operating in a different time. You're not really overthinking or thinking. You think just enough for what you need to think, but really it's almost like your body is moving on its own and you're just there to like witness the show, right? A lot of people over and over in different fields have described this, what being in the zone or being in a flow state is. Okay, if you want to minimize your blind spots, kind of like the highest level of that is going to be a flow state. So for example, for this video, right now I've been talking for about 45 minutes. This isn't rehearsed, right? And I'm not really even like reading notes or anything. I'm literally just talking. And like, where is all this information coming from? I'm just kind of talking, it's coming up. I'm not actually planning this out. There's some talking points on there, but it's kind of just flowing out. And the ability to actually minimize your blind spots, one is you have to be clear on the basics. So when it's math, when it comes to understanding, for example, how percentages work, right? When you're talking about the real world, if you want to hear people talk about the economy, like politicians, like, hey, the economy is doing great or not great, right? It's important to actually understand the basics. And to understand the basics, usually it will take you at most 5 to 10 minutes. Okay, the very, very basics. And then from there, all of a sudden, it's a lot harder for people to fool you. And it's a lot easier for you to make a judgment on whether someone is actually making sense and they can back up what they're saying, or they're just kind of full of it, right? So that's very important. The second one is the ability to notice as you're going on autopilot, right? So I talked earlier about like patterns, like people will notice, oh, I have a pattern in a relationship, I self-sabotage, right? Well, as you're self-sabotaging, if you can actually notice, or you can actually observe the you that's doing that, all of a sudden the view, the choices you have, and really even the actions will change, right? And there's a lot of different ways to cultivate that ability, right? One way is to meditate. Meditating isn't just to impress a girl, right, or to show them that you're a spiritual person, or you're sensitive, you're working on yourself. Like meditation, if it's done right, is actually to train the ability to actually be present in the moment where you could go on autopilot or to tune out. Right, and then third and finally is to train your ability to hold multiple perspectives, right? And that kind of builds upon the second point I'm making, right? The more often you can actually be present and notice what you're doing, the higher your capacity to hold multiple perspectives. You're actually holding multiple perspectives when you can decipher nuance, right? So one of my favorite YouTube investment channels I follow, right? Something the guy always says is it's important to be part realist, part pessimist, part optimist, and then part conspiracy theory, right? And it's kind of a joke, but it's also true, right? Because if you can actually be open to all of that, and then from there you still make your own decision, it's going to make it where you're a lot more dynamic in your decision making, and it's easier for you to just kind of go down a blind spot and do something that you wish you didn't do, right? And when it comes to in the game, right, what if you were able to actually view the impact of something from an individual's perspective, from leadership's perspective, from others people's perspective, and then what about from the people that disagree with you, or from the opponent's perspective, right? What if you're actually able to kind of observe all of that at once when you're viewing why something happened the way that happened, or the influence on other people? All of a sudden it'll be very, very different, right? But if I had to summarize this down to one spot, the ability to actually observe is the most important, right? Well, because once you can observe without getting sucked into these things that are influencing you, the range of options you have is different. And then from there, it's really important, whatever you're going to get into, at least understand the basics, right? Obviously, you know, I did this, I watch YouTube videos, I learn from people that are explaining stuff, but I also, what I really want to do is ask questions and research and understand the fundamental building blocks of something. So then when I'm watching these videos, make a lot more sense. So this will end up being the longest video I think I have ever made. It's going to come up on about 50 minutes. If you watch all the way to the end, please like and subscribe. If you haven't yet, please do that. Really makes a difference, especially liking the video. Actually subscribing too, just do both. But again, thank you guys for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.